Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Rise of the Dragon, an old inventory-based adventure game that's a bit different from the norm. Now, the thing is, this was the first such game to come out of a company who made a name for themselves primarily with action games and simulators. So it's clear someone at the company had a vision as far as this title was concerned, especially given the amount of effort that went into building the lore of the world and the primary protagonist. But is the game any good? Well, that depends on your definition of good. This is one of the few instances I know of in consumer-level gaming where the primary goal of the dev team was to make the game extremely immersive. So a huge amount of effort was put into just that aspect, resulting in an experience which is kind of tricky to give an overall assessment of. Well, from an artistic standpoint, the game is phenomenal. Well, from an audio standpoint, the music is fitting and mostly decent, save for a couple throwaway tunes, while the sound effects are lacking and dull. The storyline is pretty much NARC meets Blade Runner, and as for the gameplay itself, well, let's just say I have a lot to say on that front, both good and bad. Rise of the Dragon was developed by Dynamix and published through Sierra Online in 1990. Now, Sierra publishing an inventory-based adventure? Sure, makes sense. Dynamix making it. That's the intriguing part. In terms of video, it supports EGA 320x200 16 color and VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, and supports a fair array of audio devices. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, but a digital copy is readily available for purchase from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com for $6, which also comes with digital scans of not just the game's manual, but a comic that was included, which serves as a huge dose of satire to help build up the lore of the game, as well as scans of the hint book that was sold for the game, which includes lots of behind-the-scenes info. However, if you'd rather go for a physical release, there's several things you need to know. Firstly, and this is paramount, the EGA and VGA versions of the game are not the same. The EGA release came after the VGA release as a cost-reduced version, given that it could be fit on half as many discs and is considerably more difficult to come across given how few people bought it. In fact, the release on GOG only includes the VGA version. However, disregarding the EGA version, all other versions of the game are super common, and I came across dozens of listings for them all while scouting out the details on physical copies. But something disturbing I noticed is that nearly every copy out there for sale right now has its asking price about 2 to 3 times higher than pretty much every copy actually sold in the past year. The game normally sells for about $20 to $30 fully boxed and $10 to $20 loose, but most of the listings I found had it pegged at $60 to $80. Trust me, the game does not sell for that much. It's not even remotely rare, not even the 5 1/4 inch disc release. If you want a physical copy, wait for a sane price to pop up before you go for it, because the game's really common and the proper prices will show up. Beyond DOS, however, there was also a Sega CD release of the game. Now, the Sega CD port came a good while after and sacrifices graphical fidelity, given the limits of the Sega CD system, in exchange for a full voice track, which the DOS version doesn't have as it never got a CD-ROM upgrade. There's a few other minor differences between them both too, but ultimately, you should get the one for the platform that you most want to have it on. Or both. The story of Rise of the Dragon takes place in the year... Actually, that's a very good question. I don't think an actual year is mentioned anywhere in the documentation, in the hint materials, not even amongst all the satire in the comic book. Well, it is mentioned that there's 20 billion people on Earth, but everything I've read online suggests that it's impossible for Earth in its present state to support more than roughly 11 billion people without the death rate and birth rate reaching parity, so I don't know. Let's just say it takes place in 7654. That way we'll all be way too dead to care anymore when that year rolls around. So, the game takes place in Los Angeles in 7654, where drugs have been running rampant along with a new kind of drug seeping into the normal supplies being given out, which kills its users by horribly mutating them to death. Now, one such drug user who dies right at the start of the game was daughter of Mayor Giuseppe Vincenzi, who decides the police are not going to cut it for investigating this new drug problem and the death of his daughter, instead deciding to enlist the support of our star protagonist, William Hunter, also known as Blade, an ex-cop turned private investigator. The deal the mayor offers isn't great, but the job seems simple enough, so Blade accepts and the game begins. I should quickly point out that the physical comic which came with the game recreates the opening sequence in comic panels, but that the section after that with the mayor and Blade speaking in person is omitted from the game itself, as the game starts as Blade decides to get out of bed and begin his job. Also, I'm going to do my best not to spoil too many story points for a reason which will become apparent by the end of the video. Now, I started this video by saying that this is a very different inventory-based adventure game, and this is immediately apparent as there's 3 things you have to get used to right away: the controls, the in-game timer, and the inventory. First, let's talk controls. They're actually pretty simple, but take a bit to get used to. Your primary mouse button activates objects when you click on them, or performs the action indicated by the mouse cursor, such as engaging in dialogue or getting up close to a particular device. A second mouse button looks at things and can also be used to identify where the exits go, and then you can also move things around by clicking and dragging, and this is typically used to move collectible objects around, or to pull collectible objects out of a device that they happen to be inside, such as by pulling ID cards out of card readers. Now, some of this may seem a bit counterintuitive. For instance, when you unlock a door, you still have to open the door following. And when you press a button to eject an ID card, you still have to pick up the ID card and put it somewhere. These are things which you'd think which would happen automatically, and in most inventory-based adventures they would. But here, it's all manual. Again, this was a conscious choice by the devs to make the game more immersive, by having the player actively perform every individual action intended. It takes some getting used to, but once you are used to it, it really does feel like second nature to perform all these actions. So yeah, this particular aspect of the game, while somewhat unusual, does increase the immersion factor. This kind of leads into the inventory, where we have to knock a point. See, you can open your inventory in one of 2 ways, either with the primary mouse button or the secondary mouse button. If you use the primary button, the inventory is put into a use mode, where you can click and drag things out of the inventory and into the world to use them on something. Now, I need to point out right away that sometimes items won't work on something until you're prompted to do so, and other times they will. So bear in mind that just because you're using the right item on the right thing in the world, you may not have triggered the ability to do it, thus why it isn't working. Using the secondary mouse button to open the inventory, or looking at any object in your inventory at any point in time, puts it into a mode where you can only have items interact with Blade himself in a side window. Now, apart from that side window, the 2 modes look identical, but only one mode lets you have items interact with the world. Regardless though, if you use an item in the world and it does nothing, it'll simply fall into a stack at the left corner of the screen. While in this state, the item is now unsafe and can be lost if you leave the screen, so make sure you pick up everything in that corner before moving on. In fact, if you fall asleep anywhere that isn't a safe place, all non-critical inventory items are lost. Speaking of sleep, let's talk time. Everything in this game is on a time limit, and the actions you perform will advance certain amounts of time. And normally, this is an aspect of these kinds of games which can really irk me, but fortunately, Rise of the Dragon gives you a lot of time to mess around. And in fact, if you do everything perfectly, you'll burn up maybe a third of your total allotted time that the game gives you, and that's not counting time you would intentionally have to burn to get events rolling, as various events will take place as time progresses, with special meanwhile sections showing up to indicate events that are transpiring. Now, if you do find yourself ahead of schedule, you can use the arrow buttons at the top of your inventory to advance time by either a minute or an hour. Though when advancing by an hour, time will stop advancing the instant something important comes up. As you progress through the game world, you'll be conversing with a number of individuals. Now, the conversation in the game is kinda clunky. The people in this game world behave in very odd ways and don't always stick to the personalities they seem to be assigned. For instance, one such character, known as the Jake, has some extremely unpredictable reactions to the dialogue choices you're given, as he seems to be angry in some moments, cowardly in a few, and chill in others. I mean, there's no actual randomness to the conversations. Once you know which options get you where, you can just repeat those same choices in the future. It's just, the reactions don't define the characters very well, and seem more built for sake of progression than for lore building. I should probably point out too that it's actually kind of hard to enter an unwinnable state in this game. You totally can, don't get me wrong. Heck, I actually died within the first few minutes when I first started playing because I tried to walk across this incomplete section of the building as I didn't realize there was an elevator, given that you can exit Blade's apartment in 2 different ways, despite leaving out of the same door either way. But time marches on, and even if you make some terrible decisions, you may still end up beating the game anyways, just because of all the stuff that transpires. In fact, the game will encourage you to reload a save game if you screw up really badly, though you can still enter an unwinnable state without being informed. In any case, the story has a few optional things you can miss depending on the selections you make. You can take Blade's girlfriend, Karen Sommers, out on a date, but can still beat the game whether you do or don't. The Jake can stay in touch either by phone or in person at the Pleasure Dome, and either way, you can end up at this moment in the game where it suddenly becomes Contra. So yeah, hidden away in this game are a couple quote-unquote arcade sequences, where the game transitions pretty hard from being a point-and-click into a run-and-gun platformer, with one-hit death traps and unavoidable enemies. The weird thing too is that these sections control very badly. You use the numeric keypad to move, though you have to use the diagonal keys to crouch walk. You shoot your gun with spacebar, which takes a moment when you're on the ground but can be fired rapidly while jumping, and jumping is done with the enter key. I mean, okay, I get it. This isn't Contra. They're trying to make this feel more real by having Blade face off against opponents in a fashion which would normally be pretty deadly. I mean, it's not like he's jumping 50 feet into the air and... Well, never mind. Blade can jump so high he can scale a 2-story building in one bound. Damn it, if the devs wanted a Contra section in their game, they should have just made it play like freaking Contra, because these arcade sections are worthless. They have the worst music in the game, no semblance of enemy design, the most basic of puzzles and platforming, bosses which are a joke, and you get unlimited lives. In fact, the game will flat up let you skip these sections if you fail them 5 times in a row. Which is probably a good thing, considering that for players who felt they were getting a good point-and-click adventure, to suddenly be forced into not Contra with super clunky and boring gameplay, if there wasn't a way to skip these sections, those players would be very mad. Anyways, after clearing one arcade section, having to rescue Karen, and then doing another arcade section, I've now beaten the game. Already? So, one of the reasons why I avoided delving too deep into the plot is because it's short. Like, really short. If not for the arcade sections, you could feasibly speedrun this game in about 10 to 15 minutes. Heck, because of the ability to skip the arcade sections, if you die 5 times, combined with there being insta-kills right near the start of both of them, that might even be faster than playing them properly. But overall, I have to say, Rise of the Dragon is an interesting game. Again, from an artistic standpoint, this thing is amazing. They crammed a ton of highly detailed artwork into this, going the extra mile with the comic book too. And as far as the gameplay is concerned, most of what's here is definitely immersive once you get into it. And I do like that it makes an effort to either prevent an unwinnable state or warn you when the game becomes unwinnable. But because the game's so short, that doesn't really matter too heavily. Still, this isn't a game for me. I prefer adventure games which aren't on a timer, as I don't think very fast and thus want to be able to approach such games at my own pace. But if you like what you saw in this video, then chances are you'll enjoy giving this game a run yourself. Just remember that it's very short and you'll likely be done with it before you know it. You need to set a fairly low fixed cycles count when running this game, otherwise the audio drivers might not initialize properly. I recommend a setting of 9000 as that seemed to offer the most consistency. Now, this actually does make a handful of animations run too fast, but going any lower causes some other aspects of the game to play out too slow or with screen tearing. So a rate of 9000 seems to be the best balance between all of that, without breaking the audio. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up on Saturday, February 1st will be an ADG mod video, where we'll be tackling some level editing for a pretty well recognized game, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.